We've just got some breaking news in from Buckingham Palace, folks. So this statement has just come in from Buckingham Palace, and I'll read it for you. It goes on to say, His Majesty has today initiated a formal process to remove the style, titles, and...
The decision did not arrive with ceremony, applause, or a carefully prepared royal speech. It arrived behind closed doors, carried in a sealed red box, and placed directly before Camilla. With one final signature, King Charles removed her right to use the title of Queen, reducing her official standing in a move that stunned the palace. But the deepest shock was still hidden. Princess Anne had quietly shaped the decision. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Camilla read the opening paragraph twice, as though the words might change under the pressure of her disbelief. They did not. The royal directive, a formal written order carrying the king's authority, stripped her of the title Queen and reduced her public position to that of the monarch's consort, meaning the spouse who supports the sovereign without holding equal royal power. Her fingers tightened around the page. Decades of humiliation, recovery, and hard-won acceptance had been compressed into a few cold lines. Charles remained standing across from her, silent and rigid. He had spent years defending her place beside him, against public anger and resistance inside his own family. That history made this moment more brutal. The title had not merely raised Camilla's rank, it had represented his promise that she would never again be treated as an embarrassment hidden behind palace walls. Now he had signed away the very symbol of that promise. Camilla finally lifted her eyes. "Did you choose the crown over me?" she asked. The king looked toward the sealed box instead of answering, and that hesitation wounded her more deeply than any official wording. His silence confirmed that the decision was not temporary or open to negotiation. He had already crossed the line she believed love would prevent him from crossing. Then she saw the handwritten phrase in the margin, constitutional continuity. The term meant protecting the transfer and limits of royal authority from one reign to the next. Inside the family, those words carried Anne's unmistakable voice. A documented palace account later confirmed that the Princess Royal had met Charles privately 3 times before the directive was prepared, each conversation taking place without Camilla's knowledge. Camilla lowered the document, but her anger did not fall with it. "How long has your sister been deciding my future?" she asked. Charles's face changed before he could control it, revealing that Anne's influence had begun long before this final signature. To understand why Anne's quiet intervention carried enough force to remove a queen's title, the story must turn to the 3 people trapped at the center of this royal fracture. This was never simply a battle over a title. It was a collision between a husband's loyalty, a sister's sense of duty, and a woman who had spent years believing the hardest part of her royal journey was already behind her. Charles, Camilla, and Anne entered the crisis carrying different memories, different fears, and different definitions of what protecting the monarchy truly meant. Charles sat alone with an old photograph resting between his hands. It had been taken before his marriage, when every public appearance with Camilla carried judgment, and every private promise felt like an act of defiance. She had remained beside him through scandal, rejection, and years when acceptance seemed impossible. That history mattered because the title of Queen had become more than a royal position. It was proof that he had finally kept his promise to protect her from public humiliation. Camilla understood that promise differently. She believed her place had become permanent, secured not only by marriage but by years of service beside the king. A royal consort is the spouse of the reigning monarch, expected to support the sovereign without possessing the same constitutional power. Yet, she had begun to feel that Anne no longer saw her as a trusted partner. At recent family gatherings, the Princess Royal had stopped asking for her opinion on ceremonial seating and senior engagements, leaving her outside conversations she once expected to influence. Anne felt the distance too, but she refused to soften it. She prepared notes for another meeting with her brother, carefully removing every personal reference to his wife. The Princess Royal viewed titles as responsibilities granted in return for duty, not emotional rewards that could never be questioned. She felt genuine sorrow for Charles, knowing exactly how deeply he loved Camilla. But sympathy could not erase what she believed had become a dangerous confusion of authority. William's concern added pressure without a direct accusation. In a documented private exchange with Anne, the prince had spoken carefully about stability, warning that unclear boundaries inside the palace could eventually weaken the next reign. He never demanded Camilla's removal. He did not need to. His fear gave the king's sister a stronger reason to act, because the future monarch would inherit every unresolved conflict Charles left behind. Charles closed the photograph when Anne's name appeared on his private schedule. He knew she would arrive with facts instead of emotion, while Camilla would see the meeting as another betrayal arranged beyond her reach. 3 people were now defending 3 different promises, and none of those promises could survive together. The true fracture, however, had begun earlier. 1 royal ceremony, 1 altered instruction, and 1 quiet refusal had convinced Anne that Camilla had crossed a line that could never be ignored. That ceremony appeared graceful to the public, but behind the palace doors, 1 altered instruction pushed the family beyond the point of quiet compromise. Every royal rupture has a moment that later becomes impossible to forget. For Anne, it came during a private planning session before a major Commonwealth service, when Camilla changed the order of precedence without consulting the king's senior advisors. What seemed like a small ceremonial adjustment carried a much deeper meaning. It placed Camilla's personal authority above traditions Anne believed protected the crown itself. Camilla gave the instruction calmly, almost as though nothing important had changed. An aide was told to move Anne behind members of the Queen Consort's own family during the ceremonial procession. The Commonwealth Unity Service at Westminster Abbey was designed to present royal unity before visiting dignitaries and representatives from across the Commonwealth. The order of precedence meant the formal ranking that decided who entered first, where each person stood, and how authority was presented to the public. Changing it was not merely moving names on a page. It altered the message of power. Anne discovered the adjustment while reviewing the final arrangements and immediately understood what it implied. The Princess Royal could have treated the move as a personal insult, but that was not what disturbed her most. Camilla's relatives held no constitutional role, yet they were being placed ahead of a working royal who had represented the crown for decades. To Anne, the change suggested that private preference had begun to overrule public duty. Tension followed her into a side chamber where Camilla was waiting. Anne asked for the original arrangement to be restored before the service began. The Queen Consort refused. She argued that her position as queen gave her the right to reshape the ceremony around the king's household. Anne answered that supporting the sovereign did not mean creating a separate center of authority around his wife. Camilla's voice hardened. "The old order cannot govern every decision," she said. A documented account from the planning meeting preserved those exact words in a handwritten note made by a senior aide. Anne later kept a copy, because the sentence sounded larger than the immediate dispute. It suggested that the challenge was not about one procession. It was about who had the right to redefine the monarchy's rules. Charles learned of the change only minutes before the service. His expression tightened when he realized Camilla had acted without his approval, but he refused to create a public confrontation. The king quietly restored the original order and instructed the staff to proceed as though no disagreement had occurred. Camilla obeyed, yet the silence between them made clear that nothing had truly been settled. Anne entered the service with controlled calm, but her judgment had already changed. She no longer saw the incident as a family disagreement. She saw it as proof that Camilla's title was producing competing authority inside the palace, and she began building a private case Charles would eventually be forced to confront. Months later, that hidden record would be placed between Camilla and Anne during a confrontation Neither woman could escape. The confrontation began without raised voices, but the silence between the two women carried years of restrained resentment. Anne entered the room holding a narrow blue file. Camilla remained seated and refused the offer of tea. With no aides present and no family members to soften the exchange, the king's wife and the king's sister finally spoke openly about power, loyalty, and the title now hanging between them. Anne placed the file on the table, but did not open it immediately. She had requested the meeting after Charles repeatedly delayed acting on the ceremonial dispute, hoping direct honesty might prevent the conflict from spreading through the family. The Princess Royal believed silence had already made the danger worse. A ceremonial title is a role of honor and public support, not a separate source of command equal to the sovereign. That distinction now stood at the center of everything. Camilla broke first. She accused Anne of never truly accepting her marriage to Charles, and said the language of duty had become a shield for personal dislike. The queen consort reminded her that she had endured years of public hostility, only to discover that acceptance inside the palace remained conditional. Anne listened without interruption, but the accusation struck deeply because she knew her brother would hear the same argument if the matter reached him. Anne opened the blue file. Inside were dates, altered instructions, disputed appointments, and documented moments when Camilla's household had overruled long-established palace procedures. She explained that a royal household is the staff and office supporting a senior family member, and its authority must remain clearly below that of the monarch. Then she placed the handwritten Commonwealth service note between them. Camilla's expression changed when she saw her own words preserved on the page. The old order cannot govern every decision. Until that moment, she had believed the sentence belonged to a private argument. Now it existed as evidence. She closed her hand over the note and demanded to know how long Anne had been collecting material against her. Anne's restraint finally hardened. She said the issue was not whom Charles loved, nor whether his wife deserved dignity after years of rejection. The issue was whether Camilla had begun treating the title of queen as an independent source of command. Then the Princess Royal delivered the words that ended any chance of a gentle settlement. "You were asked to support the sovereign. You were never meant to become a second one." Camilla shut the file with sudden force. She warned that Charles would never choose his sister's judgment over his wife, and insisted that Anne had mistaken influence for victory. The Princess Royal did not argue. She had already placed a copy of the evidence before the king, and his silence was no longer protection. The argument was no longer confined to two women, because Charles now faced a decision that could destroy either his marriage or his authority. Anne never demanded that Camilla be punished. She did something far more powerful. She forced Charles to examine what would happen if he did nothing. In a series of private meetings, the Princess Royal stripped away the emotions surrounding his marriage and reduced the crisis to one brutal question. Could the king preserve the crown's authority while allowing another royal household to behave as though it possessed equal power? Anne spoke with the calm of someone who had already measured every consequence. Her influence came from decades of service and a reputation for discipline that even Charles rarely challenged. The Princess Royal was not known for entering family disputes without reason, and that mattered because the king understood her silence was usually deliberate. When she finally intervened, it meant she believed the institution itself was in danger. Charles listened as she placed three options before him. He could publicly correct Camilla, formally restrict her household, or remove the title that had created confusion over the limits of her role. A royal household is the staff and office supporting a senior family member, while a royal directive is a formal written order carrying the sovereign's authority. Each option would expose the fracture, but only one would make the boundary impossible to misunderstand. Charles flinched when Anne described the title as a privilege that can no longer be defended. The king asked whether she understood what those words would do to his wife after everything Camilla had endured. He reminded his sister that the queen consort had survived years of rejection and had trusted him to protect her from another public humiliation. Anne did not deny the pain. She admitted Camilla would feel betrayed and that Charles might never forgive himself for signing the order. But the Princess Royal warned that future monarchs could not inherit uncertainty created by his reluctance to draw boundaries. William would one day receive not only the crown, but every unresolved weakness left inside it. Then Anne revealed what Charles had not been told in full. According to separate documented accounts, several senior advisors had raised concerns about competing instructions coming from the king's office and Camilla's household. The conflict had moved beyond family feeling. Staff were beginning to ask whose command carried final authority. Anne placed a draft directive on the desk. She did not demand a signature. Instead, she told Charles to destroy it if he believed his private promise mattered more than the crown's clarity. Then she left him alone with the decision. Charles pushed the document aside. Hours later, he pulled it back toward him and read every line again. By morning, the king had summoned the official responsible for preparing the final version. Once the king's pen touched the page, the consequences moved faster than anyone inside the palace could control. The title vanished first from a confidential schedule. Then it disappeared from briefing papers, ceremonial instructions, and the wording of future engagements. Before the public learned anything, Camilla watched the palace quietly adjust to a reality she had not accepted. Every small change carried the same message. The decision was active, the machinery was moving, and the place she had fought to secure was already being dismantled. Camilla received the revised engagement folder from her private secretary, who paused before reading the new form of address. The queen consort understood that the change was not simply about words. Her Majesty the Queen had carried public rank and ceremonial authority, while the narrower consort designation reduced her role to supporting the sovereign without appearing to share his command. She took the folder, closed it, and dismissed everyone without comment. Silence made the loss heavier. Camilla removed a handwritten speech prepared for an upcoming reception and read the opening line again. It celebrated her work as queen and thanked the guests for recognizing the role she believed had finally become secure. She tore the page in half, slowly and deliberately, because those words now belonged to a life the palace had already begun erasing. Charles's decision spread through the institution with ruthless speed. Staff received instructions that Camilla could no longer issue independent directions involving senior royal precedents, major state ceremonies, or appointments shared with the king. Royal precedence means the formal order deciding who leads, follows, or stands closest to the sovereign during official events. Losing control over it stripped away one of the clearest signs of her influence. Then the structure around her began to break apart. Several members of her household were reassigned to Charles's central office, where all major decisions would now be approved. The queen consort realized the directive had not merely changed her title. It had removed the network that allowed her instructions to move through the palace without challenge. The authority she once exercised was being returned, piece by piece, to the king. Camilla searched for a motive she could fight, and found none. A documented palace account confirmed that Anne had requested no new role, privilege, or public recognition in return for her intervention. The Princess Royal had not tried to claim Camilla's influence for herself. That revelation made the wound sharper because it removed the easiest explanation: jealousy. Anger gave way to a colder need for truth. Camilla did not appeal to Charles again. Instead, she requested one final private meeting with Anne, insisting there would be no files, no advisors, and no royal titles used between them. What passed between them in that unguarded meeting would transform punishment into something neither woman expected. For the first time, Camilla entered the room without expecting Anne to surrender, and Anne arrived without intending to win. There were no secretaries, no briefing papers, and no royal forms of address. Two women who had spent years protecting different parts of the same man finally faced the cost of their choices. What followed was not forgiveness, but an honesty sharp enough to change the final shape of the decision. Camilla spoke first, because silence had already taken too much from her. The queen consort admitted that the title would not be restored, and that her household was already being reorganized. A royal household is the office and staff that support a senior member of the family, and losing control of it meant losing the practical power behind her public position. She no longer came to argue over procedure. She came as Charles's wife, asking why Anne had pushed him toward a choice that had broken something inside their marriage. Anne listened without the armor of duty. The Princess Royal answered as a sister, rather than a senior working royal, meaning a family member who carries out official responsibilities on behalf of the monarch. She said she had never wanted Camilla erased, but she could not ignore a title being used in ways that blurred the king's authority. Still, the words sounded different now, because there was no file between them, and no institution to hide behind. Camilla finally revealed the fear beneath her anger. In a recorded private conversation, preserved by a trusted palace aide, she confessed that status had become protection against history. And without the title, she believed future generations would reduce her to a mistake Charles once made, not the woman who endured years of rejection to stand beside him. The queen consort admitted that every challenge to her rank had reopened the old belief that acceptance could be withdrawn at any moment. Anne's expression softened, but her position did not. She confessed that she had underestimated how deeply public hostility shaped Camilla's hunger for recognition. The Princess Royal did not apologize for defending the crown's boundaries, yet she acknowledged that duty had made her blind to the human wound underneath the conflict. Camilla then asked the question she had feared most. Had Anne told Charles to remove her completely from royal life? The Princess Royal answered with a revelation. She had argued against exile and insisted that Camilla retain her residence, security, personal dignity, and meaningful charitable work. Anne offered one final truth. Charles had originally considered a harsher directive, but she persuaded him to separate the title from his marriage and Camilla's private place beside him. The queen consort left knowing her position had not been destroyed by hatred. Now she had to face the public without the title that once defined her victory. The private truth brought fragile understanding, but outside the palace gates, the world was about to turn the decision into a national spectacle. By sunrise, the palace's private fracture belonged to the world. The announcement spread across television screens, newspaper stands, phones, and crowds gathered outside royal residences. Some saw justice, others saw cruelty. Yet one image captured the emotional force of the moment more powerfully than any official statement. Camilla, leaving a London engagement without the title that had accompanied her name the previous evening. Buckingham Palace released a short statement confirming that Camilla would no longer use the title of Queen and would continue supporting Charles in a reduced consort role. A consort is the spouse of the reigning monarch, expected to support the sovereign without holding equal royal authority. Broadcasters repeated that the decision did not end the marriage or remove her from the royal family, but it clearly reduced her ceremonial power, public rank, and influence over major events. Charles watched the first television bulletin from Clarence House without speaking. The king heard commentators describe the announcement as a historic correction, but his silence deepened when one presenter called it a victory for Anne. He switched off the screen before the segment ended. The decision may have protected his authority, yet the public language of winners and losers made him feel that his family had been turned into a national contest. Camilla refused to disappear. Advisors urged her to cancel a scheduled charity visit, warning that every gesture would be examined and every word judged. The queen consort insisted on attending. Her hands trembled when the host read the revised introduction, carefully avoiding the title that had defined her place only hours earlier. She paused, then continued, choosing duty over retreat, even as the loss followed her into the room. One newspaper front page dominated the reaction. A photograph of Anne entering Buckingham Palace appeared beneath the headline, "The Sister Who Saved the Crown." The Princess Royal had asked for no public praise, but the image turned her quiet intervention into a symbol of resistance. Supporters called her brave. Critics accused her of breaking her brother's marriage from within. Outside Buckingham Palace, the division became impossible to ignore. Some people applauded behind the barriers, while others held signs defending Camilla and condemning what they called a public humiliation. The crowd revealed why the moment mattered so deeply. Old memories had returned, and the monarchy was once again being judged through love, loyalty, and unresolved resentment. Charles understood that silence could no longer control the story. He began preparing a final family statement, not to reverse the decision, but to define what Camilla's fall and Anne's intervention would mean from that day forward. The final verdict would not restore what had been taken, but it would decide whether this royal fracture ended in bitterness or purpose. In the end, no one truly emerged victorious. Camilla lost the title that symbolized her acceptance. Charles preserved the authority of the crown, but wounded the person he had spent years protecting. Anne succeeded in drawing a boundary, yet carried the knowledge that duty had required her to break her brother's heart. The final decision endured because each of them accepted a painful truth. Monarchy survives only when personal desire stops where public responsibility begins. Charles issued one final statement after the public storm had reached its peak. The king affirmed that Camilla remained his wife, his companion, and a valued member of the royal family. But he also confirmed that the title of queen and the authority attached to it would not return. A consort is the spouse who supports the sovereign through ceremonial and charitable duties, without sharing the monarch's constitutional power. That difference would now be protected by clearer rules, ensuring no future household could blur the line again. Charles met Camilla privately before the statement was released. He apologized for allowing the crisis to deepen until the choice became so cruel. She did not forgive his silence, and she did not pretend the wound had closed. Yet Camilla acknowledged that he had chosen what he believed the crown demanded. The king had preserved the institution, but the cost would remain inside their marriage long after the headlines faded. Anne visited her brother once the announcement was complete. The Princess Royal found no victory in the result, and he offered no congratulations. Charles told her she had been right about the danger, then added that being right had not made the pain easier to carry. She understood. Her intervention had protected the monarchy's structure, but it had also forced her brother to break the promise he most wanted to keep. Camilla refused to let the title become the final word on her life. Through a documented statement released by her revised office, she confirmed that she would continue selected charitable work. The queen consort had lost rank, but not her marriage, her service, or her ability to build a different legacy from what remained. Anne returned to the blue file one final time, after the new rules were formally adopted. She destroyed it in private. The Princess Royal no longer needed the evidence because the boundary had become permanent, and her purpose had never been control over Camilla. The verdict was final. Love may shape those who wear the crown, but it cannot rewrite the limits of royal power. Camilla left diminished, not erased. Anne emerged burdened, not triumphant. Charles remained a king who chose institutional survival over personal protection. The palace doors closed on the conflict, with no celebration and no revenge. Only the solemn understanding that the crown had survived because 3 wounded people finally accepted what duty required. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.